by a very small little bit of maths. And by the way, I just wanted to introduce you to the IISc logo. You see the front page. What you see on the left side, my left side, is okay. Right side is the seal of the Indian Institute of Science. The seal is a cleaned up version of the original seal that was produced, and there have been multiple versions of it. This is the latest in that chain. And what you see on the in the middle is a logo, something that can be fun and interesting and exciting and working with the day. So, we are known, Indian Institute of Science is known as IISc to many people. So we wanted to bring that to the fore. What you see on the left side is a logo of the department that I run, Center for Product Design and Manufacturing, or CPDM. I'll introduce both of them in a second. So let me start with this thing that I call innovation cycle. So what you see on the top is society, and what you see is a cycle. So something that starts from the society and then ends at the society. It doesn't quite end. It starts again, and it goes in cycles. What starts is opportunities and problems. Okay, there are things that we are not happy with, things that we want better than now. Better roads, better electricity, better chairs, and that starts it off. And we eventually find some means of fulfillment of that opportunity or a solution to the problem. It goes back to the society. How does it go back to the society? It goes in multiple elements. Okay, and I'm going to mention 6 elements here. That cycle is what we call innovation. How do we get something, opportunity from the society, and bring the solution back to the society? That's innovation. So it starts with opportunity or problem. Somebody says I don't like this, or somebody says I can do better, and then somebody says, okay, I can do it this way. An idea. Somebody says, well, I can do that by making a product like this. Somebody says I can implement that using a production process like this. Somebody says I can supply it this way, and somebody says, well, I can incentivize the system monetarily by creating a business around it. So all 6 elements are important. Now let's do a little bit of maths, very simple maths. Okay, we'll call these valleys or depths because all of them can go wrong. So we can ask the question, is the opportunity right? Is the right opportunity that we are looking at? There are so many problems, so many opportunities in the world. Which one should we look at? If we get the right opportunity, there are many ways, many ideas of how we can fulfill that opportunity. Which one is the most appropriate? How do we embody this idea into a product? There are many ways of doing it. Which one is right? How do we implement this product? How do we make this product? There are again many ways. Some are better than others. How are we going to supply all the elements that are required in order for this object or this solution to be available with the people who need it? And finally, what's the most appropriate business model with which we can implement all of these? Now, each of them can go right, each of them can go wrong. So here is the little maths. Let's say that we have a 50% chance of success at each of those stages. Then our overall chance of success is 1.6%. Not a very flattering number. No wonder that 95% of startups pretty much fail. Now let's increase the chances of success in each stage, make it 95%. We have a decent chance of about 74% of success. That's roughly the stage, okay, or the level at which IISc operates. Which means that you need to spend effort in each of these 6 elements. It's no good just saying, okay, here's a great opportunity, and therefore my innovation is great. You need to put effort into each of them. Let's look at an example, okay? And the example comes, and no offense to NASA, this is an example from NASA, okay? This is the example of a very complex mission that NASA entrusted itself into, which is to collect particles from the solar wind. So if you have to collect particles from the solar wind, you have to get close enough to the sun without getting burnt, of course. So they had to design and make and send a space probe, which is called Genesis space probe, 1.6 million kilometers from the Earth. That's a lot of distance. So to go there, collect the particle and come back, it would take about 4 years, right? And in order to make sure that when it enters back into the Earth's atmosphere, that nothing goes wrong, what did they do? They made a redundant system. What is a redundant system? A system where you do the same thing in multiple ways. For example, in a typical aircraft, you have two engines. Why do you have two engines? Because in case one engine fails, the other one is very unlikely that both the engines fail at the same time. So you'll hopefully land. Okay. So that's called redundancy. For example, if you're running a very power critical system, you always put a power backup. You don't depend only on the grid. That's redundancy. So what did they do? They put two parachutes. They put two parachutes on this space probe so that at least one of them will open when it comes back to the Earth's atmosphere, so that it floats in midair, and then a helicopter will come and pick the parachute from midair, so that there are absolutely no chances of it hitting the ground. Okay, so we then go down 4 years, okay, 2001, and then this is entering the Earth's atmosphere. The probe, and oops, it hits the ground. So, in other words, an effort that took a fair bit of money, and the money is actually quite clear. It's about 250 million US dollars, but also, several years of work from some of the brightest people on the earth, and they still failed. What happened? Well, the moment something like this happens, there is a committee that is formed, and the committee looks at what happened. So they looked at that, and they found out that the company that made the space probe, which is typically where we put the blame for, say, oh, you didn't make it properly. It turned out that they made it exactly as the designers asked them to do. In other words, the problem was with the design. Okay, and I'll not get into the details of that. Essentially, what happened was that the switches that were supposed to open the space probe, they didn't open, and as a result, neither of the parachutes opened, so it had a free fall onto the Earth. So the message, what is the message that you take from this? The message that you take from this is that design, okay, innovation is complex. Things can go wrong, but then things can also go right, or we can increase the chances of things going right. So let's look at some of the examples. Here is an award-winning chappal. Okay, so this is Govind Sharma and Anup Chandar, two of our alumni who designed a chappal. Now, there is a big problem with most of the chappals. At least my chappal has that problem, which is that if I want to walk on a muddy ground, it splashes water back onto me, and I don't like it. Okay, and these two people, they decided to come up with design that can overcome that issue. So they came up with an anti-splashing flip-flop or chappal, which won among 4,700 entries from 58 countries in the world the coveted Red Dot Award for a design concept. Let's take another example. I'm not going to get into the details of this specifically. Here is Mona Sharma, another ex-student, and her team in a Bangalore-based startup, okay, designed what is called Bempu. It's a wrist, it's like a little wristband that you put on babies, so that whenever the temperature of the babies go down below a certain temperature, which is what is called hypothermia, okay, too low temperature, they might die. So this wrist band, they take the temperature and constantly monitor it, and whenever it goes below that limit, it alerts the caregiver. Okay, by doing that, and this is an incredibly inexpensive device by many standards, and they basically just 2017 they saved 10,000 newborns in 25 countries around the world, which is why the Time magazine picked this as one of the top 25 inventions of the world in that year. Let's look at another example. The first racing bike from TVS. This is Arun Francis, another ex-student from our department, who went off to TVS and he did the industrial design of this TVS RR 310, which is the first racing bike that TVS produced. And it's actually a very highly selling bike. What you see on the top left is a sketch of Arun of himself, and he used his ability to do that to design the industrial look and feel of this bike in order for it to give that racing look. This is the fourth example. This is a successful agri startup, okay, called Sickle Innovation, started by started the master's project, by the way, at our department by Nitin Gupta and Nikhil Mishra, who wanted to improve the productivity of harvesting cotton on the field, which is a very quick process, okay, where there is a small window in which cotton has to be picked up, and there is increasingly less and less supply of skilled labor for doing that. So they wanted to improve cotton harvesting productivity so that those who are interested in doing it can get more money from the same period of time, so that becomes lucrative for them. And at the same time, those who need the cotton, the industry, they can get far much greater amount of cotton out of the fields. So this was incubated in CPDM, in our department's incubator, and then it has been winning these zillions of awards. I've just put some of them on the left side. But most importantly, it's also employing a fairly large number of people, and have started exporting to a number of countries, including Israel. So it has gone way beyond cotton now. It is basically picking stuff, picking mangoes, picking apples. So it's working with Himachal Pradesh government to pick apples there and so on. Last of the examples, and that's an advanced affordable prosthetic arm. This is something that again was started by two of the master students, Vinay and Nilesh. And what they said is that the person you see on the top right corner is one of our colleagues, Mr. Egnathan, and he was an excellent welder before he lost part of his arm in an accident, not inside our department or IISc, but outside. As a result of which his ability to welding has, of course, gone. So they said that, can we bring these people back to the workforce without having to spend a huge amount of money by them? And as a part of that master's project, what they created is called an under-actuated prosthetic arm, something they can contract and expand their muscle, okay, the stump of their hand, in order to open it and operate it in various ways. The complexity is something that I think you, especially those who are engineers in the audience of this webinar, would appreciate, that our fingers, okay, are an incredibly flexible set of tools with which we, without even thinking about it, can pick up a flower, a glass, or a heavy object. And they require very different grips. They require very different amount of force and very different ways of gripping. So imagine the complexity and therefore the difficulty of doing that. And the challenge that they wanted to take upon themselves is that, can I do all of that using only a single actuator, a single one, not one even for each finger? Because the money that one has to spend on this is primarily in the cost of the actuator. So if you can reduce the number of actuators, you dramatically bring down the cost, which is why I said earlier that it has to be advanced affordable. Okay, I want to dwell a little bit on this word, this phrase. See, if you want to reduce the cost of something by 1%, okay, you can think of putting a little bit less material here and there. You know, your process can be slightly this way or that way, and you can make the difference. But imagine if you have to bring down the cost by a factor of 10. You cannot do that by simply tinkering the current product or production a little bit. You have to really shake it, which means that you have to come up with a disruption, okay, and therefore think out of the box. And that is exactly what this Purak or advanced prosthetic arm does. So in order to be extremely affordable, you have to be extremely advanced. Okay, so this is an important part of dealing. So what they did was they then developed this first prototype, and then the Wellcome Trust, which is a global funding body based in the UK, they came back and they said, well, it's so exciting. This will benefit not only India but also other countries. So why don't you collaborate with Oxford and come up with another version that can be deployed across the countries? And so for 3 or 4 years they have worked together, and they have just started about 6 months ago a company called Grass Bionics that has won the Elevate 2019 award of the government of Karnataka, and is going to get funded by them. So the point is that all of these are successful innovations, and there are of course many that are not. And these are all innovated at CPDM IISc. So let me just spend a few moments just introducing CPDM and IISc. I'll start with IISc. IISc, or Indian Institute of Science Bangalore, that's just a screenshot. It's a 100-plus-year-old institution, started, funded by Jamshedji Tata, and and was created in the land that was given by the Maharaja of Mysore. So the first people, uh, the PPP, the public-private enterprise that was created as an institution, and it is, of course, the highest ranked university in India if you go by the NIRF rankings. Also, the eighth highest among the small universities in the world. Uh, it is roughly fairly small, about 4,000 students, 400 faculty, mostly PhD students, but also masters and a small undergraduate set of students. It's very strong in both science and engineering, uh, and also is the only strategic university from India that works with Boeing in long-term projects. The other two outside the US are Cambridge in the UK and Tsinghua in China. So CPDM, or Center for Product Design and Manufacturing, is the design and manufacturing phase of IISc, and it is among the top 3 design schools in India according to the QS rankings in the last few years. It is also the most research intensive design school in the country. It's not just a design school, it's a design and manufacturing school. So we have, this is the vision. We want to pursue excellence in both design and manufacturing so that we can create people and products that are systemically complex, okay, that can solve systemically complex, technologically intensive, and socially impactful solutions. So let me spend a moment on each. Systemically complex problems means problems which you solve. If you solve in one part, it can create a new problem somewhere else. For example, we can easily cut down the cost of a product by simply shifting the cost. Okay, so what you can do, for example, in a car, we can say, okay, right, your car is going to cost very little when you buy it. However, I'm going to shift the cost for its life cycle cost. Okay, you'll be paying a lot more through its life, but you'll be paying very little when you buy the car. Those are kind of problems that are called systemically complex problems. And technologically intensive means those problems that require a lot of technology to solve. And third, socially impactful means that a large number of people can benefit from the solution, okay, without having to be incredibly rich to pay for it. Now, typical solutions will be not just functional, okay, and something that works. Okay, something has to work, of course, but it has to also be aesthetic. It should look good. It should feel good. People would like to have it, and it should also be usable. It should be easy to use. People don't have to read pages after pages before they can figure out how to use it. And most importantly, it has to use very little resource while it is at use, and that's what we call sustainable. So how do we create such products? We are very much hardware centric in our vision, and in order to, of course, as a university, we will be training people, and we have three different training programs. One is a Masters of Design program that people can join, engineers and architects, and we train them in all of those aspects: technical, aesthetic, ergonomic. And we expect about a third to a half of the people who join to have their master's projects that can be patented. The second is, of course, PhD and research program in design and manufacturing. The third is an MTech program in smart manufacturing. And once again, engineers from all areas can join them. We train them for 2 years to become somebody who can go out and lead manufacturing or new future factories of the world. I will mention or discuss a little bit more about smart manufacturing at the end of my talk. So that's CPDM. Now, what is the kind of things that we need to learn as an innovator? Remember that innovation is going all the way from opportunity to idea to product um, to production to service to business, and therefore the innovation, they need to be able to design in these elements. And in order to do that, they need to have a mindset for innovation, which is called thinking or design thinking. I'll come to that. And they need to have a structured way of thinking about how to go about solving the problem. The third part is that they need to have an understanding of the science and technology behind the objects that they are creating. And by that, I mean both functional technology that are typically taught in engineering and so on, but also aesthetic technology or usability technology, and tools with which they can make it faster, easier, cheaper. So in order to do all of that, you actually do design. Now, we all use the word design, but we rarely define them and understand that what we are meaning by design are the same thing. Now, I have found in my experience of interacting with people that many people think design means making beautiful sketches, okay, or creating a beautiful pattern. So beauty is definitely part of design, but it's not the only part of design. And let's see what design is, okay? Now, all designs start with something that you are not happy with. If you are a very happy person and you are happy with everything around you, you are not a designer. Okay, here is, so design has to start with something that you want to change, you are not happy with. We'll call that undesired situation. For example, typically village folks in India have to walk a long distance, typically 3 to 5 kilometers, to the nearest water source in order to do many of their household chores. Now, you might say that that's not really very desired because it's a large distance away from home. They have to carry clothes which become heavier when they clean it and bring it back on the way back. They also have to carry water back. There may be issues of safety on the roads. The roads may be not particularly good to walk on. The washing is effort and time consuming. It also pollutes the water. There are many things that you might say is undesired and you want to change it. So what you start is you think of what might be more desired. For example, would you like the water source to be closer? Would you like a means by which women can go to the water source, say cycle down there, carry their clothes on the cycle? How do they do that? Also wash these using, and so on. So there are multiple desired situations for a given undesired situation. So this transition from thinking of the undesired and the desired situations is what is called goal forming. Okay, you create your goals. Where do you want to go? Where you are right now? And in order to achieve the goals, what you do is you start planning. Okay, for example, if you're a designer, engineer, you start sketching, saying, okay, I maybe will be able to do it in this manner. And then you hope that if you implement that as you plan to implement, that this undesired situation will become a more desired situation. Okay, for example, some of our students created a rural washing machine that is also a three-wheeler that can be manually powered, and it's a recliner three-wheeler that women can ride down to the water source, carrying all the clothes at the back, and then use the same mechanical advantage that is there in that system in order to clean it and bring it back and so on. Not necessarily the best solution, but just one more desired plan of changing the situation. So if we now look at what is design, you must understand that there are two definitions of design. One is that design is a noun, the thing that, okay, this is a design. The second is that Design is a verb, to design something. Okay, so a design, the noun is a plan. It's a plan for change, as simple as that. Okay, a design is a plan for change of some undesired situation into some desired situation. And depending on what kind of people you are, the kind of change that you want to desire can be different. If you are typically an engineer, you will be probably making a functional change. If you are an industrial designer, you're probably making an aesthetic change. If you are a business designer, you'll probably make a change in the business model and so on. The second is designing how such a plan is developed. Remember that when you are designing, you are not just designing the plan, you are designing both the goal, because what is undesired, what is desired is part of your plan. So you are designing both the goal and the plan of how to achieve the goal. Now, if you are a technical systems designer, like a power plant designer, you know, that's one kind of design that you might be creating. If you're an educator, educational system designer, like a Montessori, Maria Montessori might be designing a method for teaching children. If you're an aesthetic designer, you might be designing a logo. If you're a legal systems designer, then you will be designing laws and so on, right? Now, in that sense, as you can see, we're all designers, right? We all have situations that we don't like, and we probably try to say change that situation and so on. But then that doesn't mean that all of us are good designers and that we cannot be better, even if we are good. So the question is, how do we develop good designs? How do we become better designers? Now, there are two things that we need to keep in mind. One is that typically, when you are developing something, you're not developing for a single goal. There are typically multiple goals. For example, you want to go somewhere faster, but you also want to go somewhere cheaper. So faster and cheaper, and they might be conflicting with each other. So you need to deal with multiple goals. You need to understand which of these goals are more important so that you can focus on them, because those are the ones that people will be more likely to pay for it or to be more interested in, right? Second is that typically there are multiple ways of getting there, okay, achieving the goals. Some may be better than the others. So it is a combination of many goals. Some are more important than others, and many plans, some are better than others. So we need to therefore be able to understand what the possible goals are. How do you identify what the goals are? Which ones are more important? How to assess that? We need to be able to generate possible alternative plans. We need to be able to assess which ones are better, and we need to modify better plans based on this knowledge. And this process, as you know, and I think Mr. Hiranmoy earlier alluded to that by saying that we know that innovation is not a linear journey. He's absolutely right. Um, you may have to do this multiple times. And therefore, that brings me to the idea of design thinking. Now, in design thinking, we need to find the goals or requirements. We need to evaluate them to figure out which ones are more important, because you cannot possibly attain to all of them in your innovation process. We need to generate multiple solutions and that have a possibility of satisfying these goals or requirements, and evaluate to find out which ones are better, and modify both requirements and solutions, and go through this process until you are at a stage where you either give up or you have found what you wanted. And this is, of course, an iterative process. So this is what we call design thinking. But to help you remember this more easily, I will make it even simpler for you. We'll call design thinking IISC, where the first I stands for identify, second I stands for ideate, S stands for select, and C stands for consolidate. So identify is finding goals and requirements and evaluating them. Ideate is generating solutions, and consolidating is evaluating them and modifying these, and selecting is selecting the right requirements and right solutions. So remember design thinking, remember IISC. Don't forget the iteration that is also required. So where do you find the knowledge with which to do this? Apart from how do you carry out design thinking? Where is the knowledge? The knowledge comes from three areas. One is society, one is business, and the other is technology. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, it comes from this very simple relationship. So what you see here is that you see society on the right side, it's yellow, business in the middle, it's blue, and technology on the left, it's kind of saffron, right? So the idea is that society is interested in values. We talked about improvement of life of various forms, right? How do we change the undesired situation to desired situation? So society is interested in value, and what business does is business develops or integrates technology in order to create value proposition, okay, and then it offers to the society. Remember that cycle. So there I showed only society. Now imagine that there is also somebody in that society, okay, somebody in that society who needs that value, and somebody in that society who is ready to give that value in terms of an integration or development of technology. And this together, okay, and if they are ready, then what happens is that the business can ask for profit from the society. So society, if everything goes well, society gets value and business gets profit. And this is true, by the way, of every kind of business, including social entrepreneurship. Okay. Even if you're doing a cooperative movement, you need profit. Okay. The difference between the amount of money you spent and the amount of money you earned in order to survive. Even those who are working there requires that money. So let's make it simple. Value is performance by price. What is performance? Things that you want. More is performance, and price is what you want to pay as little. Okay. What is profit? Profit is price minus cost. So if I put these together, I get this kind of convoluted equation. But remember, as a designer, performance is something you can control. Cost is something you can control. Value is something that comes out of the society. You cannot fully control it. Okay, and profit is the difference between that, the price and the cost. So as a designer, what you need to do is to ensure that both society and business is happy. If society is happy and business is not happy, it's not going to produce the value. If business is happy and society is not happy, society is not going to provide profit and business will go bust. So the two must both be happy. It's a win-win that has to be created, which requires that both the profit and value must be acceptable, which means that as a designer, you must deal with both performance and cost in a linked manner. Okay, and design is the tool with which you do that. What you do is you draw knowledge of the society, of the business, of the technology, and you kind of create a khichdi. Okay, I hope it's a very systematic khichdi. eh? And with that, you are able to provide that value. And I'll give 3 examples to that. The first is what you require here is that you require um, 2 kinds of knowledge. One is what is called domain knowledge, and the other is what is called process knowledge. So let me give that example, and then I'll give 3 examples, one from societal knowledge, business knowledge, and technological knowledge. Domain knowledge, okay? Now, many years ago, I was involved in a project that developed in 1995 a micro accelerometer. What you see in this photograph that I have pasted there is a tiny little, about a millimeter by a millimeter, okay, uh, accelerometer. What is an accelerometer? It's a device with which you can measure acceleration. What is acceleration? It's the rate at which speed changes. Okay, how fast speed is changing. When you put your, when you start a car and you are moving faster and faster, you are accelerating. So how do you measure that? Now, why do we need to make an accelerometer? For many reasons. I'll give one. Many of these more advanced cars, they will have an airbag bag. Okay, an airbag is placed inside the steering wheel, and the idea is that if the car is decelerating, okay, reducing its speed very fast, which means that it may have crashed, okay, yeah, it may have hit something, then what happens is that you need to there is a sensor like this one which will measure that deceleration, and if the deceleration is faster, greater than some value, then it will use as a trigger in order to um, blow a balloon, which is called an airbag. And that balloon will be between the steering wheel and the person who is driving or the person who is sitting, so that he gets cushioned against hitting a very hard object like a window or something and injure or kill himself. Okay, herself. So this particular micro accelerometer, which is a small accelerometer, was novel because it used an effect called tunneling, which is a quantum mechanical effect. And it used a special manufacturing process whereby such tiny little objects can be created for microsystems manufacturing. Now, if you do not know what a tunneling effect is and what a microsystems manufacturing is, then you will not be able to come up with this accelerometer. Okay, and this kind of knowledge that you need to know what are called domain knowledge. Okay, knowledge of how things work. The second example that I'm going to give is what is called process knowledge. Okay, so what you see is the schematic that I have put on the left side is the schematic for a bath of acid. The blue thing is acid. The black outline is a bath, is a container, and the yellow block is a specimen. Okay, and what we do is we want to find out how corrosive this acid is on this yellow specimen by dipping it in that bath of acid, leaving it for a certain period of time, taking it out and measuring how its dimensions have changed. So the change in dimension is a measure of the corrosive effect of that acid on that specimen or those specimens. Now, you can say it is a corrosivity measurement or corrosivity meter, right? Now, the problem with this particular design of this particular way of assessing corrosivity is that the acid is so acidic that not only works on the specimen but also on the bath, and as a result, the bath becomes the lining of the bath gets affected, and it may have to may have to throw away the bath after some time, or you have to completely reline it, which is an expensive process. So the question is, how can you do this without being so expensive? It being, again, we are talking about multiple goals and how to achieve, those in a manner that is acceptable. Okay, a more desired situation. And going to spend time on that, but here is one, right? What you do here is that you turn the specimen into a box. So what you do is you make a hole on the specimen and drop the acid into that hole. Okay, it's a blind hole, so it stays there, and then you leave it for a while, and then you measure how the dimensions of that hole have changed as a result of the acid. Okay, now as you can see, you don't need to know anything further than you already knew when you started with the original design in order to come up with this new design. Except that I have, in my experience, found that most of my students, which are some of the brightest that we come across, find it difficult to come up with this idea. So there is a certain knowledge that one has to apply in order to create this new idea that is not trivial, even though that has nothing to do with domain knowledge, and that's called process knowledge. So we need to have both kinds of knowledge in order to do design, and this requires some people might call it creativity, or part of it is certainly creativity. Now let's look at the kind of knowledge that one has to have from society, business, and technology. First, I'll take society, because if you don't understand society, you don't understand value. What is important to people? What is the kind of change that they are interested in? Then how are you going to design something that is valuable to them? And if this is not valuable to them, they are not going to give you profit. So here's an example. This person was a senior design manager at Nokia, okay, David Mycroft, and he was walking down the streets in Mumbai, actually, and he found a boy who was trying to listen, this is many years ago, to his music on a mobile amidst very loud noise, which basically was coming from the welding that he was having to do in order to survive. Okay, and then that led to people ask the question, why, well, not people, but he started asking the question, why can't we make a louder mobile phone so that people can actually listen to music while there is a lot of loud noise around it. And that was the beginning of the, at that time, new slim speakers in what is called Nokia X6, which is of course dinosaur by now, but is very, very hotcake selling product during its days. So you must understand the needs of the user. And in order to do that, you have to immerse in the user context. Now that requires domain knowledge of the user, what is the user like, what are his aspirations and so on, and also process knowledge of how to find out their needs. And there are various ways of doing it. Let's look at profit. So what I'm showing you here is called a mobile arm support. Okay, this is something that I was part of a team that designed many years ago in Cambridge University as part of our effort to help the people who have muscular dystrophy. Now, you look at what is muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy is a disorder in which people who we typically have a protein called dystrophin, with which uh, the signals that come from our brain to our muscles are transmitted to the muscles. And if these dystrophins are less in amount in our body, then those signals don't get faithfully carried over to the muscles, and as a result, muscles don't operate. And over a period of time, if muscles don't operate, muscles don't really remain strong. As you know, you do exercise to make your muscles stronger. The opposite is also true. Your muscles become weaker without exercise. So people typically who are suffering this kind of disorder will become wheelchair bound if they can afford a wheelchair, and then um, they increasingly lose their ability to lift their arms. Okay, their finer faculty is still there. They can move fingers in a precise manner, and so on. So it is not really cerebral palsy. It is more uh, a device where you require somebody to help somebody to move things about. And so we came up with this arm support. What you see here in the arm support is a um, is a vertical rod at the back. That's basically a screw. Okay, it's a long screw. It's a long lead screw. And what you see on the white bit to which the arm is attached, that's a nut. So basically, when there is a motor at the bottom, the white bit at the bottom. So when you run that motor by pressing the switch, which this person is holding on her right hand, then this mobile arm support will go up, and it can stop there because there is a limit switch. And then if she wants to bring it down, then it comes down. And there is enough degree of freedom in the sling that on which the arm is attached for the person to move it about on a horizontal plane. So in a combination of the powered lifting and the bodily movement with the arm, one is able to reach various parts in a workspace. Okay. And we found Muscular Dystrophy Association in the UK, for instance, found this the best thing that have ever occurred to muscular dystrophy patients. However, no company was interested in starting this and taking this up and manufacture it and sell it. Why? Because it's a very high risk product. Okay. Why is it high risk? Because the people who typically buy this product are not the not the richest people on the earth. They're wheelchair bound, they're unlikely to work, they are dependent on government loans and subsidies to survive, uh, and therefore they cannot afford an expensive product. Um, Now, if any of them get injured as a result of using this product and sue the company that has supplied the product, the company can very easily go bust, right? So as a result, what the company would do in order to prevent themselves from getting bust in such incidents, they would put a large insurance price. Okay, and the insurance company will charge a great deal, which means that they would have to make the product very expensive. Now, if the product is expensive and the people who are able to are going to buy it are not able to afford that, what is going to happen? They're very unlikely to buy it. In other words, it's not a great business proposition. So as a result of that, for a long time, nobody was ready to touch it until the government came and said they are going to provide the difference in order to make up for that risk factor. And suddenly this product in 2008, it became a profitable proposition again, and there is a company that is now selling it. Okay, so once again, just go back to our theme that we must have knowledge, domain knowledge of the costs of various materials, manufacturing and so on, but also the process knowledge of cost modeling. What is likely to be the life cycle cost of such a product? What is likely to be the cost of concept? Why should you go all the way to the detailed product in order to find that it's too expensive? Can you do it at the conceptual stage inside? What is the cost to the environment? Is it going to pollute so much that nobody is going to be allowed to use this and so on? So all of that could be done. Third part is technology, right? Okay, let's take the example that is my favorite. Okay, this is one of my favorite products ever. Okay, in the technological domain, it's the Rolls-Royce Trent 700 AG. This is an engine, as you know, many people know Rolls-Royce for the car. Okay, the Rolls-Royce car. We have seen that many times in movies. Well, it doesn't exist anymore with Rolls-Royce. Okay, long ago, BMW has bought it away, and this has become a property of BMW. What Rolls-Royce still owns and designs and makes and sells are these engines. These are aircraft engines. This is the most iconic of engines that were designed and made and sold by Rolls-Royce, Trent 700. It was so successful that they had to stop making it in order for their newer products to get a chance to be sold, because nobody was ready to buy the newer ones. Okay. Now, I'm not going to spend all my time praising this product, which is of course something I can do. But let's look at one little part of this multi-thousand component, highly complex product. Okay, and that is about preventing ice formation on this turbine cone. You see this turbine cone where the arrow is. Okay, what happens is that when the aircraft is flying at a 25,000 feet or something, where the temperature is minus 50 degrees Celsius or so, I jokingly say that this is a temperature where you don't really need to mention whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius, that kind of temperature. And this aircraft is flying at a 1,000 kilometers an hour. Okay, with the relative velocity of the air, of course, is also 1,000 kilometers an hour for static air. And then suddenly this point, this singularity point at the tip, is an excellent place at which snow can start forming. And this snow will very quickly become ice. Okay, it gets compacted, and ice is incredibly fragile, so it breaks. And then these become little pebbles, right? Little pebbles that move into the turbine blades, which is further down on the right, at the speed of that relative velocity. So it's like shooting the turbine blades at a rather enormous speed. It's not good for turbine blades, right? So for a long time, people have been trying to resolve this problem, undesired situation. Okay, the first idea that comes to mind is heat the cone. Okay, and this has been a solution for a long time, by the way, except that it is a very expensive solution. The outside temperature is minus 50 degrees Celsius. So over a period of time, people evolved another design. It's called a wiggle motor. What's a wiggle motor? It's, imagine that cone is not a single part, but it has two parts. Okay, there is a little bit of a cone at the front and there is a frustum at the back. And imagine that this additional part has a little motor that is attached at the back of it, where it can from time to time wiggle, right? So you can just do dig, 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 stop, dig, 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 stop, dig, 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 stop. What happens as a result? The snow will form, but if the frequency is right, it doesn't have time to become ice. And because of shaking, the snow will come out of this cone and it will fly harmlessly into the turbine blade without causing any problem, right? So that's a lower cost. So clearly your value, right, is higher because performance is high, yet the price is low. As a result, your profit is also going to be low. So it's going to be a much better acceptable proposition. Now let's get further down. Over a period of time, people also felt that why can't we make a cone of flexible materials? Okay, slightly flexible materials that wiggles anyway because it's slightly flexible from all the vibration that is there in the engine. We don't require to put an additional motor in order to wiggle it, right? So in other words, no additional energy is even further lowering the cost. Now, as a designer, you ought, of course, to come up with these ideas, you need to have the domain knowledge of various technologies. You need to know how heat transfer works, how motors work, okay, and how to make it wiggle, how materials work, and so on. So therefore, that is important. But also, you need to know how to create ideas. For example, can you learn from the way in which animals behave when, for example, a mosquito is sitting on their nose? Okay, then they are going to move something, right? In order to take the mosquitoes out of there. So, can we learn from biology, for example, to come up with new designs that we cannot think of? There are other methods called brainstorming, trees, and so on. So, all of that can be therefore brought in. These are examples of process knowledge. So, now, if I now summarize all of that into say, okay, what kind of skills therefore are needed? Of course, you need to have domain knowledge. You need to have both hands-on knowledge of how to make stuff, because you need to test it out and see, but also cognitive knowledge, knowledge of thinking things up, planning things, and so on. The second part is the creativity, the imagination, the process knowledge in a broad terms. You also need to have motivation. Okay, you need, as a startup person, as a designer, as an innovator, you need to have a lot of motivation, because things will not work the first time. Things will not work the second time, things will not work the third time, and many more times after that. But you need to get on with it. You need to keep making changes and fix it. And you need to have excellent communication skills so you can talk to people, okay, learn from them, but also impress upon them what you're trying to do. You need to have interpersonal skills. You cannot do all of that yourself. You need to have multiple people working with you. So therefore, there has to be a team, not only the team that you have in your startup, but also the extended team outside. And of course, you need to have an ability to learn, because you cannot possibly have learned all of that as part of whatever education you have got, right? As you go along, you will have different needs for learning, and you'll have to pick that up. So these are, in a summary, the kind of skills that you need in order for designing as a driver of innovation and your startups. So one area where I think there is a huge opportunity for innovation, okay, and therefore startups, is Industry 4.0. Now, what is Industry 4.0? Industry 4.0 means that the number 4.0 is used for two meanings. One is that it is the fourth revolution, okay? So there are industrial revolutions that have happened on the earth in the past. The first typically is referred to when we talk about the time at which, well, okay, right. So let's say if you go back a couple of 100 years ago, right, everything used to be done by people or animals, right? The energy of making stuff used to come from animals. Now, if you are manufacturing something, which means you need to make something, you need to put something together, you need to inspect whether this thing that you have made is made right, and so on. Okay, those are the kind of typical activities there. Now, to do them, who is going to do that? Somebody has to provide energy to make it, okay, and somebody has to think, okay, if everything is going to work together. So there is a thinking energy that also has to come. So this making energy, or physical, the motive power and the decision making power are the two components of any factory or any manufacturing, right? Now, between these two, who is going to do that? Typically, this motive power, the raw power that is required for cutting metals and putting things together and so on, that used to come from either people, okay, people would make it by hand or feet, or it would come from animals. So the first industrial revolution was when, okay, the steam engines were made efficient enough that they became affordable for large companies to use as prime mover in their factories. Okay, James Watt did not invent the steam engine. That's a common mistake. James Watt improved steam engines such as those of Newcomen's, okay, which was invented at least 50 years before James Watt, to an extent that it was efficient enough that people could afford it. Okay, and that was one of the major precursors to industrial revolution, where by and large human power was replaced by machine power. Second industrial revolution happened when when electricity was invented, or electricity was brought to a level where they can be moved at a distance safely and efficiently and so on, affordably. And suddenly what would happen is that you don't have to produce the power where you are consuming it, right? So your manufacturing can be far more distributed. The second thing is that it is also to do with how organized way you can use your laborers, not laborers, your labor, in order to make something. So if people work in unison with each other in an organized manner, then of course the factory can be far more efficient than otherwise. So that's the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution is when computers were brought in order to make individual machines more controllable, okay, more sensible and so on. So that is the third. And the fourth industrial revolution, which is right now sweeping or being, major revolutions are happening around the manufacturing industry, is about connected intelligence. Can I take all the elements in a factory and connect them together digitally so that the entire factory can become a distributed unit that can take decisions together by collecting data and utilizing that data to see whether its health is right and whether there are changes to be made. Okay, and that is what is called Industry 4.0 in a broader sense for the entire enterprise, not just for the factory, supply chain all the way. Okay, and in order to demonstrate how this Industry 4.0 works, the Government of India, Department of Heavy Industries, have funded 4 centers to be created around the country, one of which is called I for India at IISc, okay, is situated at CPDM at IISc. Okay, it's funded by a program called Samarth Udyog Bharat 4.0, and there are multiple companies that are involved in part funding this: Faurecia, Yaskawa, Toyota, Tata Consultancy Services, and Ashok Leyland, to state a few. And what is it that we are trying to do? We are trying to do 2 things. Thing number 1 is that how can you use these elements of Industry 4.0 to not only bring in more automation, which is typically the Western view of Industry 4.0, but also to empower human labor in order to make them more productive, better quality, and more safe and so on. So how can you empower humans is one view. How can you do efficient manufacturing using automation is other view. In order to see which kind of views would operate well in what kind of situations, we're creating 2 different Industry 4.0 demonstration platforms. Okay, the first one will be probably more suited for a very rich and expensive company, and second one may be more suited for a micro or medium or small enterprise. So what you see here in this diagram are 2 versions of this a canonical factory, a typical factory. The reds are the what happens in a factory. Some materials come, they get stored, they get inspected, then some operations take place on them. So changes are made to the material, and eventually they are again stored and inspected to see whether the changes are as required, and they go out. This is what is described here in these 2 diagrams. The reds are the incoming and outgoing storage and inspection. The blues are the materials operations like cutting, welding, assembly and all that. And the yellows are the movement of the material from one place to another. Now the top, what you see on the top and the bottom are almost similar, except for the fact that the first one is the view of the automation intensive Industry 4.0, and the bottom one is the view of the labor intensive Industry 4.0. Okay, where in the first one you have machines that already have built-in capability to collect and give data, and the blue lines that you see across these elements are that connectivity. Okay, and where these machines and the movements are all going to happen with robots and AGVs, automated guided vehicles, and so on. And this data is going to come to an analytic station, which is at the top right corner, where the health of the entire system is going to be analyzed, and changes have to be produced, and instructions for changes have to be passed back. Right? In the bottom one, the same thing will happen. This is also connected, where the legacy, the manual machines are going to be instrumented with sensors so that data can be collected from them. But the movements are going to happen by either cranes or humans. But still, again, data analytics will happen and instructions will go back. So we would like to see how these two operate and how these can help improve the typical things in a factory. Now, what does this have to do with startups? See, these views of Industry 4.0 right now are supported by, for example, CAD modeler, PLM software, various pieces of hardware, sensors, connecting devices, industrial IoT devices, and so on. They are very expensive, and they typically work better with when you are making a completely new factory. They don't work very well when you already have an existing factory and you want to retrofit stuff. So that gives a huge opportunity for innovation, okay? And say, okay, how can we create an incredibly advanced, affordable sensor, a connecting device, a piece of software that can glue one kind of information with another, and so on. And that's the opportunity for you. And this is just a glimpse of the smart factory that we have developed. What you see is the inauguration of that with the Secretary of the Department of Heavy Industries, who is testing out a virtual reality in device to see a complete simulation of this entire factory. Okay, this simulation is indigenously developed, and what you see at the bottom is a digital twin, the complete digital model of the entire factory, where you can simulate and see everything before I cut any metal. And at the bottom left, what you see is an automated guided vehicle, which is carrying a collaborative robot for doing stuff such as assembly or handling. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say. But before I finish, I want to mention one more thing that's an opportunity for all of you. It's a medical technology geriatric healthcare technology business incubator that is situated again in our department at CPDM, which is called CPD Med. And this CPD Med is something again open to everybody. Anybody who has a startup inside, with a registration in Karnataka, and you're welcome to join that. And finally, that's my thank you slide. I can see Hiranmai is getting worried whether I'm taking too much time. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Professor. I mean, I could not take my eye off from the slide that you are going through. And as I introduced you to the entire stakeholders who have participated today, I mean, you are not only an amazing academician, you also bring policy frameworks in pictures, the heuristics in picture, and ensure that we get the best out of it. At this outset, I would like to welcome Sri M. Nagarajan, the Commissioner of Higher Education. Sir is with us. So he is a great passionate supporter about innovation, entrepreneurship. He sits in the board of this iHub, and also as a Commissioner of Higher Education, he is driving innovation and entrepreneurship activities in the state. And one of the first things that he started doing when he came to this department was introducing design thinking in every university, and the kind of steps. And I was asking him, sir, kitna jaruri hai is cheez ko? He told that very necessary. And today, after listening to you, what we realized, we talked about functional knowledge, we talked about cognitive knowledge, and also process knowledge. And probably the domain and functional knowledge are something that teachers teach, but the process in the behavioral knowledge probably systems like design thinking. So I'd like to request Nagarajan sir to share his thoughts and comments. He has gone through the entire talk of his.
Well, nice to meet you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us, Professor Amreshji. And we have been very excited for this conversation because in our series of this 100 webinar, we have been touching upon innovation, design thinking, entrepreneurship, funding, and even marketing strategies, and all the spectrum of the entire startup value chain. But fundamentally, we all have been focusing on design because that is the start of anything. That is the start of anything that is meaningful and that is actually oriented towards the solution. So we constantly stress upon design thinking, and we delivered a lot of inputs on the steps in design thinking, the processes involved in design thinking, why it is important. So we had various approaches to design thinking, and today your very informative session has added a bigger sort of it's icing on the cake, because it is connecting us to the mainstream of what design thinking is happening, and how it is making a small design choices is making very big impact at the industry level and the real world. So I think these are very eye-opening information for the students who is our target audience here, and they have joined us on Zoom and Facebook. And fundamentally, if your design is right, your solution is going to be much more effective and much more, effective in actually solving your problem. So that realization we have ensured that the entire ecosystem is understanding. They're not just going to make some random efforts into finding a solution, but rather identify the problem first and then start working around it to find a solution. So, and identifying the right problem, the value system that is associated with the design. For example, are you designing for customer is right, designing for solution is right, but what is the value that drives you to the solution? So that design should be having an impact on the society. It should be having a inclusiveness. It should be having a broader focus, not just for that venture, but into an overall scenario of your context of your innovation. That is also we have been stressing very often, because sometimes some hi-fi things make the students go into one direction, leaving out certain important aspects of the fundamental purpose of entrepreneurship and startup. So in that sense, your session has been very useful, and I think we should take some questions, Hiranmay.
Yes, quick question, value versus cost, जिसमें हम बात कर रहे थे, and the question is exactly dot on that point, that value versus profit. Sorry. So when you trade off between value versus profit, how do you take choices? कितना value में कितना profit?
Yeah, so there is no standard answer to that question. Okay, and this question, the answer to this question will also will also vary from at what stage of your startup you are. Okay, and I think when you're trying to establish yourself, probably the value will be more important than profit, because you need to get your first customer and your second customer and so on. But over a period of time, when you are a more mature business, then you can take a broader view of this and say, fine, we are casting our net wider, and therefore we can think of a lower margin and a larger. So yeah, so there is no standard answer to this question. Very much depends on what startup, what's your volume, but whatever it is, try to make your customer base bigger. If you can make it bigger, it becomes less risk prone. It's not just you're designing for one person, you're designing for a larger group of people. And one approach for doing that is what is called platforming. So what you do is, you don't make a separate product for everyone. You make a by and large same product, and then you make little changes to that in order to give variety. Okay, that maybe it's different segments of the customer base may require, and that's another way of reducing your cost. So you don't have to ask for more money from them, but by cutting down your own cost, you are going to get still enough profit.
Wonderful. Professor, one question comes from Manikam. He says you highlighted on end users are the best source of describing undesired solution. You started the entire flow of telling how innovation starts from undesired solution and discomfort. He says that, is there a national database available of all these undesired solutions which should be made available to everybody to start innovation?
Well, I don't think there is a national database, and even if there were a national database, it would be constantly evolving, because of course today's undesirable is not necessarily tomorrow's undesirable. So I think it might be a very good idea, but who is going to do this? This question will arrive. But I leave that to Hiranmay's group. Do you have a database of problems? Because problems are constantly changing. And before you answer that question, Hiranmay, I want to just make one comment here, that the entrepreneur or the startup person, he must have his own okay, deep understanding of the problem. It is not picking up something from a database and then solving a problem. That may be just a pointer for him or her. He still needs to go to the ground, see what the people are, understand their aspirations, understand their state of affairs, and from that identify the right opportunity. So even if that database is there, there is a lot of work that has to be done to ground oneself in that.
Wonderful. I think, Professor, you rightly touched upon. In the interest of time, what I will do is I will assemble all the questions and mail you and maybe take some inputs from you. But broadly, whatever you told today, the framework of innovation, and you rightly started in the beginning that innovation starts from society and ends at society. So the cyclic approach is very, very important. And in the process that you mentioned, you move from the opportunity to creating value, and that's what is a broad picture that each of us need to take care of. And one of the comments that I saw on Facebook Live session is people are saying they got a broad perspective of systemic level design and systemic level innovation. Because many times we only do design a component or a tool and don't think what it will affect in the value chain in terms of maintaining that innovation and creating it. So the broad perspective that you brought in about systemic level of design and systemic level of innovation probably is much more important. So it's like whether you create a canal to take water from point A to point B by a cost of 30 rupees per liter, or you really innovate to dig water at the source where the water is needed. So cost, value, and the process, right, and the system level that you mentioned is very, very important. I think that's a very strong message. Many often our student innovators think that the product which is visible in front of them is the only tangible system that they need to take care of, but probably they need to think through that if they deploy this solution in the market, a solution in the market, who will do the next part of the value chain covering, and this is very important. और मैं जितने भी participants उनकी इस बात को उदाहरण के माध्यम से समझाना चाहूँगा. There was a startup we funded to design a beautiful machine which can cultivate grass in a small machine without soil, and the product was beautiful, it was appealing, but then when there was a need of this machine at Coimbatore, in Ladakh, and everywhere else. Now, once you get demand in the market and get supply chain created, you also need to create that integrated value chain of entire after-sales service and everything else. So only a beautiful innovation, a patentable innovation, profitable innovation doesn't end there. It actually takes into the next stage of integrating the entire value chain. So I think you really highlighted very well.